I never used to get invitations from my parents. Not to birthdays, not to holidays, not even to funerals. So when the thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment in Charleston, embossed with my family's crest, I nearly tossed it straight into the trash. For most of my life, I had been the disappointment. Too quiet, too unconventional, too uninterested in the social games that kept my parents' world spinning. But curiosity, that old traitor, made me open it. The gold script inside read, Family Brunch, Saturday, 11 a.m., the Charleston Crest Club, private terrace. My parents' signatures gleamed faintly below. I stared at the words for a long time. The Charleston Crest Club wasn't just any place. It was their place. The heart of Charleston's elite, where deals were whispered over mimosas and secrets traded like currency. It was also the same club that had banned me years ago, after my mother told management I was an embarrassment to the family name. It was strange, being invited back. Stranger still was the feeling that came with it. A pull, not of affection, but of finality, as if this brunch wasn't just a meal, it was an ending. Or maybe a beginning. I set the invitation on my coffee table, where sunlight caught its edges. My reflection shimmered faintly on the gold foil, and I thought about the woman they'd see on Saturday, the woman they'd mocked for years, the daughter they thought they'd broken. They had no idea who I had become. The years since I'd last spoken to them had not been kind, but they had been productive. After being cut off financially, I had left Charleston with nothing but my car and a secondhand laptop. I'd worked odd jobs, waitressing, managing small events, even cleaning houses for people who probably dined beside my parents on Sundays. But through it all, I'd been watching, learning, waiting. My parents' world revolved around prestige and ownership. They measured worth by what could be bought, who could be controlled, and they assumed I'd never understand that language. But money has a strange way of finding those who are patient enough to learn how it moves. In the years that followed, I found my footing in real estate, quietly, methodically, acquiring small properties, flipping them, building capital. Eventually, I began investing in hospitality spaces, restaurants, boutique hotels, and finally, private clubs. By the time I was 30, I had holdings my parents couldn't even imagine. Not that they ever noticed. They never asked what I did or how I lived. To them, I'd vanished, which made it all the more poetic that I now owned their sacred ground. The Charleston Crest Club had been struggling quietly for years. Its old guard management hid the losses, but the debts mounted. When it went up for sale under a shell corporation, I saw my chance. It took 6 months of legal maneuvering and discreet acquisitions, but eventually I signed the papers. The ink was barely dry when the final transfer cleared, making me the sole owner of the club that had once thrown me out. No one knew it yet. Not the staff, not the members, certainly not my parents. The anonymity clause in the purchase agreement had kept my identity sealed. Until now. Saturday approached like a storm front. That morning, I dressed deliberately. I didn't wear a designer dress or expensive jewelry. Instead, I chose a pair of jeans, faded, custom-tailored, and worth more than my parents' entire brunch bill. I paired them with a white blouse and a soft leather jacket. Understated elegance. The kind they'd never understand. When I arrived at the club, the valet hesitated before taking my car. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but I smiled politely. I could already feel the whispers starting as I walked through the marble lobby. People always talk louder when they think you don't belong. The hostess at the front desk looked startled when I gave my name, but she quickly recovered and led me upstairs to the private terrace. I could already hear the laughter. Familiar, sharp, practiced. My parents were surrounded by Charleston's finest. Pearls, linen suits, polished smiles. My mother was radiant in her pastel ensemble. the picture of Southern grace. My father's booming laugh carried across the terrace. For a moment, I was 10 again, standing on the outside of their perfect picture. Then my mother saw me. Her expression faltered. My father turned, his smile tightening. The hush that followed was almost satisfying. Every eye on that terrace studied me, the outcast daughter who dared to show up in jeans. And then, as if rehearsed, the laughter started. It began with my father's booming voice, followed by my mother's brittle giggle. They looked me up and down, delighting in the humiliation they assumed I'd feel. Someone whispered something about poor taste. Another joked about wannabe rebellion. I stood there, calm. Every insult rolled off me like rain against glass. But when my father called for the club manager and said, "Get her out of here before she embarrasses us further," something inside me clicked into perfect focus. The staff hesitated, uncertain. The manager looked pale. I stepped forward, letting the sunlight catch the silver clasp of the envelope I carried, the one embossed with the same gold crest as my invitation. The laughter began to die down as I laid it on the table in front of them. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the terrace fans above us. My mother tilted her head confused. My father frowned. Inside that envelope was the truth. The ownership transfer documents, the club charter, and my name printed clearly on every page. Their world was about to shift. And as the manager's eyes widened and the color drained from my father's face, I felt the satisfaction rise. Not anger, not vindication, but something pure. For years, they had mocked me for being different, for not fitting into their narrow mold of success. They had thrown me out of this place like I was a stain on their reputation. Now I owned it. The moment hung in the air like static before a lightning strike. And as I looked around at the shocked faces, I realized that this silence was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Because this was only the beginning. The air on the terrace thickened the instant the manager whispered something into my father's ear. The shift was subtle but undeniable, a tremor beneath the polished surface of laughter and champagne. I watched his confident expression falter, his posture stiffen as the words sank in. My mother's perfectly manicured fingers froze mid-gesture around her mimosa glass. It was almost cinematic, the way realization crept across their faces. One by one, the brunch guests' conversations quieted. The sound of silverware against fine china faded until there was only silence, thick and uncomfortable, stretching across the terrace like an invisible curtain. No one dared to speak first. They were waiting for the next move, for my father's reaction, for mine, for someone to explain how I, the estranged daughter, had just disrupted Charleston's most sacred social circle. The manager stood frozen between us, clutching the envelope I'd placed before my parents. I could see the tremor in his hands as he glanced from me to my father, unsure which side of this unseen war he was supposed to stand on. I didn't rush him. Power didn't need to shout. It waited. Finally, he cleared his throat and read aloud the name on the document: Sara W. Langford, sole proprietor and managing owner, Charleston Crest Club. The words struck like a gong. My mother's hand slipped, sending a streak of orange liquid cascading down the white tablecloth. My father's jaw tightened. Around us, the other guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between my parents and me. These were the same people who had once pitied me, whispered about my failures, called me that poor girl who couldn't keep her head straight. Now, they didn't know where to look. I felt a strange calm. For so many years, I had replayed this moment in my mind, what it would feel like to finally stand before them as someone they couldn't dismiss. But in reality, it wasn't rage or triumph that filled me. It was relief, the weight of years of judgment, of always being the lesser one, began to fall away. My father reached for the papers, his voice low and controlled, the way it was always when he was on the edge of fury. He skimmed the pages, his eyes darting over the legal seals, the signatures, the date of transfer. He looked for an error, something to disprove what was right in front of him. But there was none, because I had planned this too perfectly. The club sale had been conducted through 3 shell corporations and a private trust. The last owner had been desperate to unload the property before bankruptcy rumors spread. I had offered a clean buyout, cash in full through an investment firm registered in New York. Only after the transaction was sealed had I transferred the ownership back into my own name. The anonymity clause that once protected me now revealed me in public, in front of them all. Every step had led to this brunch. I didn't need to say a word. The document spoke louder than I ever could. As the realization set in, my father's confidence cracked. His shoulders sank, and for the first time in my life, I saw something almost like fear flicker behind his eyes. My mother tried to recover, offering a trembling smile to the table, pretending it was all some misunderstanding. But her performance couldn't mask the truth anymore. The staff began to gather near the entrance, unsure what to do. The manager looked at me for guidance, waiting for direction. The same man who had once escorted me out of this very terrace years ago at my father's command. That memory returned sharply. I had been 23, humiliated, holding back tears as my father told everyone within earshot that I was no longer welcome among respectable company. I had walked out then, vowing never to return. Now I was standing in the same spot, and every person who had witnessed that moment years ago was watching again, but this time they were silent. It was poetic justice, though I didn't smile. I gave a small nod to the manager, and he immediately understood. He excused himself and quietly instructed the servers to continue business as usual. The brunch resumed, but the tone had shifted entirely. Conversations were hushed, eyes flickering toward me in disbelief, admiration, or envy. My parents' friends began whispering to one another, their loyalties already calculating where to fall. Because in Charleston, power was currency, and now I held it. I could feel my parents unraveling in real time. My mother's composure slipped first. Her trembling hands couldn't stop adjusting the pearls around her neck, and her eyes darted between me and the onlookers. My father, on the other hand, tried to salvage control. He leaned back, forced a tight smile, and pretended to laugh. But the sound was hollow, strained, the kind of laugh that comes from someone losing their grip. He had built his entire life around appearances, and mine had just shattered his illusion. I stayed there for only a few minutes longer, long enough to let the silence do its work. Every second I stood there was another reminder of who held the power now. Not the family name, not the old money, not the title he once flaunted, but me. When I finally turned to leave, I could feel their eyes burning into my back. My mother called my name, but I didn't turn. I walked through the terrace doors, past the portraits of Charleston's elite, my father's picture among them. It struck me how fragile it all was. How one transaction, one signature, could rewrite an entire legacy. The club was mine now, but that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was that I no longer needed their approval. As I stepped out into the sunlight, I took a deep breath. The air smelled different now, fresher, lighter. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. My father wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. I knew there would be consequences, and part of me welcomed them. Because this wasn't just revenge. This was a reckoning that had been years in the making, and I was ready for whatever came next.
The silence after that brunch lingered for days. It hung in the air like humidity, thick, inescapable, and impossible to ignore. Charleston had a way of digesting scandal slowly but thoroughly. By Monday morning, whispers had become stories, and stories had turned into gossip wrapped in polite conversation. Every phone call between my parents' circle carried the same question. Was it true? Yes, it was. I didn't need to confirm it publicly. The documents were enough. The club's board knew, the staff knew, and by the end of the week, every member in Charleston's social registry knew too. The name Sara Langford suddenly had weight again, only this time it wasn't pity they attached to it. It was fear. For the first time in my life, people returned my calls. The same investors who once ignored my proposals now wanted meetings. The same families who had turned their backs on me at galas suddenly remembered me fondly. It was strange, almost surreal how quickly respect could be bought once it was backed by power. But beneath the surface of that polite acknowledgement, I could feel the resentment brewing, especially from my parents. I knew my father wouldn't accept public humiliation without retaliation. He had spent decades building an image of perfection, his influence woven through the city like invisible thread. The idea that his estranged daughter had undone all of it in one afternoon must have been unbearable to him. He didn't call me. Neither did my mother, but they didn't need to. The silence between us was an active thing, a storm gathering momentum. The next week, I went back to the club for a meeting with the staff. The manager, still uneasy around me, led me through the offices on the second floor. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The faint smell of old money, the polished marble floors, the portraits of men who believed their legacies would last forever. We met in the same boardroom where my father once held business luncheons. I could still picture him sitting at the head of the table, commanding the room with charm and authority. That same chair was now mine. The staff listened attentively as I outlined my plans. I didn't want the Charleston Crest Club to be a museum of pretension anymore. I wanted to modernize it, bring in new members, new events, make it a place of inclusion rather than exclusion. Some of the older board members looked uneasy, but most of the staff seemed relieved. They'd been working under fear for too long. Still, I noticed a few familiar last names on the member list. Families who were loyal to my father, families who would likely resist any change I brought. I made mental notes. Change, I knew, would not come quietly. That evening, as I was leaving, I noticed something strange. My car, parked in the reserve section, had a long, deliberate scratch across the side. It was deep, done with precision, not accident, a message, not vandalism. I stood there for a long time staring at it under the glow of the street lamp. Charleston was beautiful at night, quiet, slow, hauntingly elegant, but beneath that beauty, it had teeth. I didn't report the incident. I didn't need to. I already knew who had sent the message. 2 days later, my father made his move. He called an emergency meeting of the club's old board members, trying to argue that the sale had been illegitimate. His claim was that as an original founding member, he should have had first right of purchase. It was a desperate attempt, one that might have worked if I hadn't already anticipated it. When I arrived at the meeting, he was already there, surrounded by his usual allies. My mother sat beside him, face painted in calm detachment, though I could see the tightness around her mouth. They didn't acknowledge me as I entered. The room felt charged. I could sense the board's discomfort. These were people who had always deferred to my father. They were used to his authority, his charm, his money. To question him felt unnatural, but I had something he didn't: legitimacy. Every paper, every signature, every transfer was airtight. I'd spent months ensuring there were no loose ends. I let him speak first, let him posture, let him lay out his arguments in that confident voice that once terrified me. When he finished, I simply handed out the finalized corporate filings. There it was, in black and white, my ownership, legally binding, fully verified. There was nothing he could do. The room went quiet again, just like it had at brunch. He tried to regain control, but the more he spoke, the more he revealed his desperation. It wasn't just about the club, it was about control, about losing the power he had spent his life maintaining. Watching him unravel, even slightly, was unsettling. He wasn't just angry, he was scared. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. For all the years he had made me feel small, for all the times he'd called me a failure, I was now seeing that it had never been about me not being enough. It had always been about him being afraid of losing control. That fear was his weakness. After the meeting, I stayed behind in the boardroom. The staff had cleared out, the lights dimmed, and I found myself alone in that cavernous space filled with echoes of the past. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who used to cry in the same parking lot after being told she'd never amount to anything, the one who believed her parents' love had to be earned. That girl was gone. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of sadness beneath the satisfaction. Revenge didn't erase the past. It only illuminated it. And now that I stood on the other side, I realized something. I didn't just want to win. I wanted them to understand what they had lost. And I wanted to know if they ever felt even a fraction of the pain they'd caused me. As I left the building, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass doors, calm, poised, unrecognizable from the woman they used to mock. The club lights behind me glowed gold against the night. I could hear faint music drifting from the terrace. Life inside went on as if nothing had changed, but everything had. My father's empire was beginning to crack, and the deeper those cracks spread, the more truth they would expose. What I didn't realize yet was that revenge had a way of growing, quietly, uncontrollably, and soon it would consume more than I ever intended.
Charleston has always been a city of whispers. It doesn't shout its scandals. It lets them slip through garden gates and travel across marble floors until everyone knows without anyone ever saying a word. Within a week, the whispers became something sharper. My father's name, once spoken with respect, now carried an edge of mockery. His own allies had begun to turn, quietly distancing themselves from him to protect their reputations. It wasn't loyalty that held Charleston's high society together. It was convenience. And once that convenience was gone, so was the loyalty. I hadn't expected it to happen so fast. The power shift was seismic, and even I struggled to process how quickly the ground had moved beneath us. Every morning, the local society pages ran thinly veiled references to the family scandal. Every brunch, every cocktail party was an echo of the moment I laid that envelope on the table. I didn't need to attend the events to know I was the topic of every conversation. I had become what my mother once feared most, a headline. But not the kind she controlled. The first real sign of their unraveling came in the form of a call from the bank. My father had been leveraging the family's assets for years, using the illusion of wealth to maintain his influence. The club's collapse under his oversight had triggered a domino effect. Loans were called in, investments were reevaluated. He was bleeding money faster than he could replace it. I didn't feel pity, not yet. The same man who once told me I was a financial liability was now drowning in debts of his own making. My mother, always the master of appearances, tried to salvage what she could. She hosted luncheons, donated to charities, smiled, drew clenched teeth in front of cameras. But beneath that polished exterior, she was unraveling too. I could see it in her eyes when our paths crossed again, an empty, hollow look she couldn't conceal. I ran into her for the first time since the brunch, 2 weeks later. It wasn't planned. I had stopped by the club to oversee renovations in the dining area, and she happened to be there, standing in front of a wall of family portraits. Her reflection in the glass looked smaller, thinner, like the years had finally caught up to her. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending not to see her, but she turned and our eyes met. There were no words exchanged, only silence. She looked at me like she was seeing a ghost, part regret, part disbelief. I could tell she wanted to say something, maybe even apologize, but pride held her back. Pride had always been her cage. I nodded once, politely, and walked past her. As I moved through the halls of the club, I noticed subtle changes.
Staff who once ignored me now greeted me with respect. Board members who once looked down on me now sought my approval. The balance had completely shifted. But the more control I gained, the more I felt an emptiness growing where satisfaction should have been. Revenge was intoxicating in theory. In practice, it was lonely. That night, I went through old files, sorting through the paperwork from the club's purchase. Hidden among the financial records, I found something unexpected. Letters from the former owner addressed to my father. They detailed unpaid dues, disputes over contracts, and most tellingly, requests for my father to step down from the board years ago due to misconduct in financial reporting. My father had been hiding the club's financial decline for far longer than anyone knew. He'd used his name and influence to cover it up, pulling strings and silencing critics. I realized then that his obsession with appearances wasn't just pride, it was survival. If the truth came out, his reputation would be destroyed. And now, by owning the club, I held the key to that truth. The temptation was there, heavy and dangerous, to expose him completely, to strip away everything he had left. But another part of me hesitated. Despite everything, he was still my father, and some small, buried part of me still wanted his approval. Days turned into weeks, and the tension built like a storm cloud that refused to break. My parents stopped showing up at the club entirely. Rumors spread that they were selling their estate, that my father was under investigation for tax discrepancies. Every time I opened the paper, I saw another piece of their perfect world crumble. The irony was that I hadn't even had to lift a finger. The power I now held had created its own gravity, pulling everything they had built down around them. Then came the letter, delivered by hand, no return address. Inside was a single line written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "You've made your point." No apology, no acknowledgement, just those 4 words. I sat with that letter for hours, staring at it, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it surrender? Anger? Some twisted attempt at reconciliation? It didn't matter, because by then, something inside me had shifted. The revenge I'd once dreamed of no longer felt like victory. It felt like inheritance. I had become the very thing I swore I'd never be. Cold, calculating, powerful enough to destroy, and detached enough not to care. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. My father wasn't the kind of man to retreat quietly. His silence wasn't peace, it was plotting. I could feel it in my bones, the way you can sense a storm long before the thunder comes. Something was coming, and this time, the fallout wouldn't just destroy his reputation. It would test what little humanity I had left.
By the time winter touched Charleston, the city had already chosen its side. My father's name was no longer spoken with reverence at the club. It was whispered with pity, disdain, or worse, amusement. The same people who once sought his favor now avoided him at charity galas. My mother, once the queen of every luncheon, stopped attending altogether. Her invitations stopped arriving. The mighty Langfords had fallen. I should have felt satisfied, triumphant even, but every victory came with a dull ache I couldn't quite name. I'd won the game, yet the silence that followed felt heavier than the humiliation I'd endured all those years ago. Revenge was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it left an emptiness I didn't expect. Still, there were moments, brief flashes, when I felt something close to pride, like when the staff at the club thanked me for raising wages and modernizing operations, when I replaced the exclusive members-only policy with an open community initiative, something my father would have considered blasphemous. The Charleston Crest Club began to breathe again, filled with life instead of judgment. But that's when the retaliation began. It started small. Anonymous letters slipped under my office door, accusing me of betrayal. Then came the vandalism, a broken window in the manager's office, slashed tires in the parking lot. The police called them random acts, but I knew better. My father's silence had always been his most dangerous weapon. When he didn't speak, he acted. He had lost his influence in the city, but he still had connections, people who owed him favors, old allies who thrived on revenge. One evening, as I was leaving the club after a late meeting, I noticed a black car parked across the street. Its engine idled for a long time after I got into mine. When I finally pulled out, it followed me for several blocks before disappearing down a side street. I didn't tell anyone. I refused to show fear. Instead, I doubled down. I began an internal audit of all the club's past financial records, the ones my father had managed before I took ownership. If he was trying to intimidate me, I wanted to know why. And if there was something hidden in those books, I would find it. The results were worse than I imagined. Within days, my accountant uncovered a pattern of shell accounts and falsified transactions. My father had been funneling club funds into his private holdings for nearly a decade. He'd used member fees, event revenue, and even staff payroll to fund his own lifestyle. The amount totaled more than $4 million. The evidence was undeniable. I sat alone in my office that night, the city lights flickering through the window as the truth pressed against me like a weight. This was the final nail in the coffin of the man who destroyed my confidence for half my life. With one phone call, I could end him completely. The press would devour the story. His legacy would be ash. But when I picked up my phone, my hand trembled. I couldn't do it. Not yet. Because somewhere, buried deep beneath years of resentment, was the part of me that still remembered him as my father, the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who sat beside me on the dock when I was afraid of swimming. Those moments had faded, almost forgotten, but they still existed. I hated that I remembered them. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since the brunch, I felt tears slip down my face. I had spent years chasing this moment, and now that it was here, it felt hollow. Winning didn't undo the damage. It didn't make me whole. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was soft, distant, trembling. She told me my father had collapsed during a private meeting at one of his remaining businesses. A stroke, the doctor said. Not fatal, but serious. I didn't know what to feel. Shock, guilt, confusion, all tangled together. I went to the hospital that afternoon, unsure why. Maybe it was duty, maybe curiosity, or maybe deep down, I needed to see if there was anything human left between us. When I entered his room, I barely recognized him. The powerful man who once commanded rooms now looked frail, pale against the white sheets. His left hand was weak, his speech slurred, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were the same. He didn't speak at first. He just watched me, breathing slowly. The silence between us felt like every year we'd lost condensed into a single moment. Finally, he gestured weakly toward the table beside him. There, on a clipboard, were papers, his own signature scrawled shakily across them. They were transfer documents releasing the last of his holdings into my name, his final surrender. He couldn't say it, but I understood. This was his way of acknowledging me, not as a daughter, but as the one who'd won. I signed them, not out of greed, but because refusing would have meant nothing. The war was already over. When I left the hospital, the cold air hit me like clarity. I realized then that revenge hadn't destroyed him. It had simply revealed what time and pride had already begun to erode. He wasn't a monster. He was a man terrified of becoming irrelevant. And now he was. That night, I stood on the terrace of the club, looking out over the Charleston skyline. The lights shimmered against the water, quiet and steady. Below me, the sound of laughter echoed from the new members event I'd approved. Families, young couples, people who had once been shut out. For the first time in my life, the Charleston Crest Club felt alive, not because of who owned it, but because of what it had become. Yet even in that moment of peace, I knew the story wasn't quite done. My father was still alive. My mother was still clinging to the illusion of dignity. And I, despite everything, wasn't sure if I'd forgiven them or myself. The power, the victory, the silence, it had all cost something. And soon I would learn just how high that cost really was.
The weeks after my father's stroke felt strange, too quiet, too heavy, as if Charleston itself was holding its breath. The whispers about our family had finally begun to fade, replaced by new gossip, new scandals. But silence, I was learning, wasn't peace. It was simply what remained when all the noise had been burned away. The club thrived without my father's influence. Membership was at an all-time high. The renovations were nearly complete. And for the first time in decades, the Charleston Crest Club wasn't a monument to privilege. It was a living, breathing community. On the surface, I had everything I once wanted: success, respect, independence. But inside, I felt hollow. Revenge had been my purpose for so long that I didn't know how to exist without it. I visited my father once more, weeks after the hospital called to say he'd been moved into a private rehabilitation center outside the city. My mother met me in the lobby, her posture as poised as ever, though her eyes were rimmed with fatigue. The years of pretending had finally caught up to her. She didn't try to stop me from going in. When I entered his room, sunlight poured through the large bay windows, painting the walls in pale gold. He sat by the window, thinner now, a shadow of the man who once filled every room with his voice. The television played softly in the background, showing a local news segment about the club's new charity gala, a gala I had organized. He didn't turn to face me when I spoke his name. I didn't know what I expected: an apology, an acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the garden outside. There was something haunting in that silence. Not arrogance this time, but defeat. I stood beside him, unsure of what to say. The man who had once dictated my life now sat small and quiet, unable to lift the weight of his own legacy. It struck me then that my revenge hadn't destroyed him. It had simply revealed who he'd always been when stripped of power: fragile, human, fallible. And for the first time, I felt no hatred, only sorrow. I told him, softly, that the club was thriving, that people were happy, that his name, though tarnished, would still hang in the founder's hallway because I wouldn't remove it. I didn't need to erase him to move forward. He said nothing, but when I turned to leave, I saw his reflection in the window. His hand trembled slightly. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was all he had left. When I walked out of that room, I knew I'd already said my goodbye. My mother, waiting in the hallway, asked if I would ever come back. I told her I didn't know, and it was the truth. That night, I hosted the charity gala at the club, the first one under my ownership. The terrace was filled with laughter and music, the kind that used to feel suffocating, but now sounded like freedom. I wore the same jeans I'd worn to that brunch months ago, a quiet reminder of how it all began. As I looked around, I realized that revenge hadn't really been about them. It had been about reclaiming myself, about proving that I could stand where they once said I never would. But now, standing there surrounded by people who finally saw me as I was, I understood something deeper. Power without peace meant nothing. The guests toasted to new beginnings. The staff smiled, genuinely this time. The city's elite, some of whom had once laughed at me, approached with cautious respect, but I no longer needed their validation because I had already forgiven myself for believing, for so many years, that their acceptance was the measure of my worth. After the gala ended and the lights dimmed, I stayed behind, standing under the same canopy where everything had started. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of magnolia. I thought about the girl who had walked into that brunch, nervous, uncertain, wearing jeans as armor, and I realized how far she had come. The club, the ownership, the revenge. It had all been chapters in a story that wasn't really about destruction. It was about liberation. I took one last look at the view of Charleston's skyline, glittering across the harbor. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I belonged, not because I had inherited the right to be there, but because I had built it for myself. As I turned to leave, the faint chime of the terrace clock echoed behind me. Midnight. The end of one story, the start of another. In the weeks that followed, I sold part of my stake in the club to fund scholarships for young women in Charleston, girls like me who had been told they weren't enough. My name began to appear in the papers again, but this time not as a scandal, as a force. My parents faded quietly from society. My father lived out his days in quiet recovery, my mother by his side, no longer the figures they once were. I didn't visit again, but I sent letters, short, polite, distant. The kind of relationship they taught me was normal. And yet, despite everything, I kept one photograph of us three, smiling years before everything broke. Because no matter how twisted our story became, it was still mine. It took me years to understand that revenge is never about the other person. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to destroy. And in the end, I didn't need them to see my worth. I just needed to remember it myself. So when people ask me now about that brunch, about how it felt to watch my parents laugh at me one last time before learning I owned everything they'd ever valued, I tell them the truth. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like freedom.